Hi, everyone, and welcome to the penultimate session of Virtually Conference. These last few days have absolutely flown by. I'd like to say a huge thanks to Gareth Ford-Williams for his amazing talk this morning, The Little Book of Accessibility. We are closing the conference a bit later this afternoon at 3 p.m. UK time with a panel discussion on the future of accessibility, where we're going to be joined by Pete Traynor, Georgia Rackison, and Laura Shearman. But first up, we have Simon Norris, Nomensa founder and CEO, and Joel Strohmeier, accessibility consultant here at Nomensa, with their talk, The Inclusive Organization, 21st Century Modern. In this talk, they'll discuss accessibility from different perspectives. They'll frame accessibility commercially, showing how it crosses devices, situations, and channels, providing both consumer value and a competitive advantage for organizations. As always, please do say hello in the chat, but you do need to make sure your chat settings are switched to panelists and attendees, and not just panelists, and that way everyone can see your messages and you can have a nice chat. Please do let us know there if there are any issues with the stream too, and submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. I'll get through as many as I can with Simon and Joel at the end. So without further ado, I will hand over to Simon and Joel to kick things off.
Thanks, Henry. Hi, everyone.
Hello, everyone.
So imagine this. It's 2050 and there's a class going on with 13 to 14-year-olds. They're discussing inclusive design. It's a history lesson. The teacher is talking to the class. So class, how we design today is different. In the modern era, design is celebrated and recognized as a predominantly human activity. Whilst we do see other animals from bonobos, octopi, and otters all making use of tools, no other animal uses tools like humans. We have transcended our environment. This is clearly demonstrated by the fact we occupy habitation outside of our natural air-breathing environment. We are the only animal to do this, that can do this. One of the driving forces behind the extension of our habitat idea was the mass adoption of inclusive design practice. Since the 2000s, the practice increased to a point whereby in 2030, we had an inflection point. We refer to this as the Great Change, the age of being. Many people that had previously been divided from the benefits of technology because of the way it was designed were not included as well as others, and now they were. We had overcome the limitations posed by technological devices and how we collaborated through them. Finally, we could include everyone, and this triggered an examination of what it meant to be human. One of the key changes was our use of language. We stopped talking about disability and designing for difference and looked at human behavior holistically through the lens of similarity. We started thinking about human ability and designing with the idea for everyone, together, equally and fairly. That resulted in the Great Change. And from the 2030s, a golden period of humanity emerged. Divisions started to fade. We became connected and active participants in each other's futures, regardless of geography, technology, or ability. In the period 2031 to 2035 came a cascade of technological advances. We solved fusion, cured disease after disease, reduced cancer, and Camila Gonzalo, a 17-year-old girl living in one of the Villas Miseras in Buenos Aires, solved the final piece of the AI equation, and intelligent devices became real. Our 21st century Einstein. This is remarkable considering she had a speech impairment. She spoke through her avatar, and that changed everything we thought we knew about cognition. If Camilla would have been born 30 years prior, we might have never ended up here today, virtually together. Here's a quote from Camilla from 2033. When we can appreciate people, regardless of ability, nationality, or gender, and truly listen, our sense of what is possible is enhanced by our capacity to share. We become untethered by our past and guided by our future. The class ends by the teacher setting an assignment. So class, your task is to prepare a presentation that covers the key factors about inclusion from 2000 to 2031.
What I like about this story is that we see that the accessibility barriers of today are a distant memory. I'm imagining these students seamlessly participating in their school lessons. As you say, they're making use of a virtual reality classroom setup. They're deciding upon their physical appearance using that avatar likeness. They probably have control over various other interface customizations, and I think crucially, probably their data too. What we're seeing is the power of the human mind in this classroom setup is also bolstered by the suggestion of a supercomputer technology too.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point about customization. And a key factor of the story is that there's been a paradigm shift, based on looking beyond differences and disabilities to thinking in terms of similarity and ability. Encouragingly, I'm also starting to observe this with many of the commercial engagements that we work on today.
So you mentioned there, Simon, about that paradigm shift. And I think in some ways we're actually closer to that futuristic classroom than we might realize. I think we're seeing interactions shifting from a focus on screens, with flat surfaces as our primary point of interaction, to a more sort of ambient interconnectivity. And we're seeing that this kind of computing power that we're talking about is essentially all around us.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And also, we need to think about haptic feedback, voice command, text to speech. All these factors are being integrated into the world around us. We need to think how we can design for these things well.
Yeah, so you mentioned about this designing and this interaction and integration with the world around us. And again, extending that idea a bit more, another trend that we're starting to see is we are actually starting to build and customize our own digital spaces, rather than brands inviting us into them and controlling them. And if we think about business whiteboards, collaboration spaces like Zoom and Miro, I certainly see that soon these spaces will be truly sort of flexible digital worlds. And I think we're going to start to customize what feeds of information we see, the format that it's in, and how we choose to interact as well.
Yeah, I think you're completely right there. And this is a conversation about accessibility and inclusion. So we know that accessibility generates great value when you embed it within an organization. It can often deliver competitive advantage with multiple benefits. One key one being superior customer experience. For me, inclusive design represents, in its purest sense, innovation. It is 21st century modern. This conversation covers three important aspects of accessibility and inclusion.
So you mentioned there about this connection between innovation, accessibility, and customer experience. And there are definitely a couple of organizations who are already ahead of the curve here. I'm thinking certainly around Microsoft and Apple. Microsoft in particular, they've definitely taken up the challenge to the point where inclusive design is powering their innovations on a kind of day-to-day basis. One great example is their work on the Xbox.
Yeah, the Xbox is a really great example. We can see glimpses of future applications for accessible design and inclusivity. But let's move focus back to the present day. This brings us on to our first section, which is really the arguments for accessibility and inclusivity. So we know that people use many different devices, and those devices have many interfaces. People use services and products today that span multiple devices, multiple user interfaces across multiple channels, and they use them in multiple situations.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, what you're talking about there is this real variety. And that variety in how people might interact, you know, this presents a challenge too. From a design perspective, it is complex. You know, how do we design for those channels, services, and products that you mentioned? Not just that, you know, platforms are also encouraging designers to think with content and data in mind, as much as for visual presentation or kind of specific arrangement of interface.
Yeah, I mean, that's really key information there. And on top of that, you know, with assistive technology in the mix, there's a lot more to consider from a design perspective. You know, some people don't interact directly. They do so via user agents. And thinking about this is particularly important in terms of, you know, how we see design, and more specifically, how well we can design.
Yeah, it is a challenge, absolutely, a real challenge. And we've seen designers grapple with shifts in both hardware and software before. An example, you know, consider the shift in how designers needed to approach responsive web design. Yes, it was a smaller paradigm than successful accessible design, but the process, the skills, and the considerations are similar. You know, that new flexible canvas required a shift in how design was framed. And returning to Simon's point about users not interacting directly with web pages, here we see a visual on screen which sort of brings that into life a little bit more. What we're seeing is that there's a chain, there's a complexity going on. Your website is comprised of HTML and metadata. This is interpreted by the browser and the user agent. Then we've got the operating system, which speaks with assistive technology. And then finally, we've got the user interacting with it.
And today, you know, the importance of flexible, accessible design is even more pressing, especially recently. All our lives have fundamentally changed. You know, the world has changed. Today, the COVID pandemic has accelerated digital transformation initiatives and highlighted the need for accessible technologies and inclusive solutions as more and more people are working from home and using increasing amounts of digital technology to live, work, and play. And it's also led to sort of social distancing and fewer in-person interactions, which in turn has resulted in a specific preference for digital usage. Fortunately, digital channels have been able to fill the gaps in these spheres of life.
Yeah, so you talk there absolutely about digital filling gaps, and it's certainly offered a lot of benefits. On the flip side, that said, you know, the pandemic has also highlighted various barriers which already exist for lots of users of digital technology. You know, the move toward that inclusive organization that you spoke about at the start, you know, in the year 2050, we must focus design efforts on closing the digital divide to reach that kind of future vision. And what we're saying is that essentially design needs to move toward equivalent experiences.
Yeah, I think that's kind of really important, you know, especially today, because people are working, purchasing, learning, playing all remotely. You know, we need to think more broadly about what the word remote actually means, because it means a lot more than just working from home. So, you know, again, you know, looking at what COVID-19 has done is it's accelerated this shift towards digital platforms. And interestingly, digital usage today is now not linked to a certain age. Instead, it's become mainstream across all age groups and generations, which is a good thing. And, you know, I would argue, thank goodness for e-commerce, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, there's certainly, you know, positive businesses. We're observing consumers opting to experience new brands, and yet they're displaying new shopping behaviors. And that is, as you say, driven by recent disruption to their regular purchasing patterns. You know, giving one example, Amazon's recent e-commerce surge is a single example. Their sales have jumped a not insignificant 44% year to date, and that's for Q2 2020. And that's just a single retailer. And another interesting point in this that we see is that if that e-commerce experience has led to satisfied consumers, then there's also a good chance that that kind of new behavior will stay.
Yeah, and just to sort of illustrate some other aspects of the graph, the orange line at the top represents Amazon.com e-commerce sales. Below this is the blue line, which represents third parties selling through Amazon, and the other lines represent sort of Amazon Web Service, subscription service, and physical stores. I mean, the surge in sales continues. For Q1 2021, it's estimated that for every $1 out of $5 spent goes through Amazon. Think about that for a moment. And then, away from e-commerce, the pandemic has also highlighted pre-existing barriers. There's a disparity in the accessibility of government communications internationally. Closer to home, we saw complaints about a lack of British Sign Language for televised briefings, and similar complaints for critical information being shared in inaccessible formats on Twitter, for example.
These are all really key points. And what those points that you mentioned there really come on to is that we're seeing some positives and we're seeing negatives relating to this new world. But one of the key things I think we're talking about today is that in order to succeed, we need to be thinking in terms of experience. Accessibility, we are arguing here, sits at the core of experience. And the other thing is that efforts here scale quickly. And what they do is they raise the overall bar for user experience.
Yeah, completely agree. And I mean, as we see from the diagram, accessibility sits at the core of inclusivity. Inclusive design informs the overall customer experience, which relates to the experience brands and organizations provide holistically. And this kind of brings us on to the second section, designing for accessibility and inclusion. When we consider the design from a broad lens, we think about multiple forms of interaction and not a single interface or type of experience. For example, scanning with the eye versus scanning with the ear. We have to understand how they are different so we can appreciate how to design for them individually and together. This is inclusive thinking.
Absolutely. And expanding on this, Simon, inclusive design is also, I guess, thinking about understanding in terms of equivalence, and that, I guess, is another way of saying similarity.
Or humanizing technology. So what other assumptions do you see, Joel, being made from a design perspective?
Yeah, there's a lot of assumptions for us to think about. The one which comes to mind most immediately, we have this idea of visually busy and cluttered design, in graphic design. But this is similarly experienced for screen reader users as well. If the audible experience isn't designed, and on top of that, certain elements not hidden from announcements, then that will lead to a sort of verbose, or to put it another way, highly repetitive experience. And then we've got the other side of the coin, which is that an assumption of sight very often leads to information that's lost completely.
That's interesting. So we must also consider, for example, keyboard and other input devices such as switch controls, voice recognition, haptic and audio feedback. Designing with an awareness of variety is thinking accessibly and supporting inclusivity.
Absolutely, yeah. So this designing with an awareness of variety that you talk about there, building on that, I think a key fact to consider when we talk about accessibility is that it's essentially invisible to many people. Just drawing on an example from Alistair's talk earlier this week, what we've got on the left-hand side of the slide here is we've mocked up a kind of fake Nemensa homepage. Now, the background images and the color have been removed, but sighted users can still discern structure. Whereas on the right, we've also removed the underlying code structure. And what we see is that the result is a stream of unordered text, essentially. And this is a kind of key point here. For design to be accessible, what is communicated visually needs to be matched in code. The accessible implementation might not always be immediately obvious, but it provides additional user and commercial benefits.
Yeah, really good illustration there, Joel. So In the previous section, we covered some key considerations for practitioners, designers and developers. Many of the points raised are experienced design challenges with a technical focus. There are many key considerations for policymakers, for leadership too. And this brings us on to the next section, compliance versus inclusion. So achieving compliance with accessibility guidelines shouldn't be the ultimate goal. We've heard many voices say that over the last couple of days, and this is something that we completely agree and believe in. It should be a step towards integrated inclusion. And this table provides a really good comparison between compliance and inclusion.
So this comparison, I'll just draw upon that a little bit more and bring it to life. So what we're essentially talking about here is a sort of compare and contrast of these two ideas. So if we start just on the compliance side of things, when we think about compliance, we are tending to focus on the web content accessibility guidelines. We are tending to focus on the user interface, and we're looking specifically at the digital experience. Some other factors are that compliance is reactive. It tends to be more tactical. It tends to be remediation focused and solves or focuses on a small problem. Hardly ever requires a business case. Often requires a smaller investment. Can be a faster turnaround though. And then the other thing to say is that it doesn't require a strategy. It might be part of a plan.
Yeah, and when we compare that with, say, inclusion, we see a focus on the customer experience, looking across the end-to-end journey and covering a multi-channel perspective. It tends to be proactive, it tends to be strategic, it's organization focused and collaborative. It's looking at the big picture and the commercial, as well as the consumer benefits of providing an inclusive experience. It often requires a business case and a lot more planning. Inclusion requires a comprehensive investment and stakeholder engagement. And it definitely requires a strategy with a supporting policy. And that brings us on to problems with a compliance dominant approach.
So you mentioned there about problems. If I just focus on some specific examples, I'd see when we work on different projects, we tend to see accessibility getting squeezed out of shorter projects. And that's very often because it's seen, it isn't seen as high importance or priority. We also tend to see these kind of quick win projects. They don't allow time for the team to change or improve. And it's also the most expensive approach. And this is because this remediation work, which is completed retrospectively, it has a cost implication. It doesn't tend to lead to great results.
Yeah, and when we observe remediation work in organizations, that kind of clearly communicates to us a level of maturity around accessibility thinking and practice. And on top of that, what we also see is this concept of silo mentality, or a lack of experience in teams and across teams. And this represents a capability problem.
A compliance dominant approach that can also undermine any accessibility achievements to date. When accessibility is considered more like a checkbox exercise than an ongoing process and commitment, it's easy to undermine existing progress accidentally. For example, it's easy to replace an existing system, like a CMS, with a new solution, and then not realize that you've taken a step back. Many new solutions, they tend to be marketed as accessible, even if they're not. And that marketing, it's sidestepping the point that the new system needs to be designed to be accessible. It's not accessible out of the box. And that's essentially resetting any achieved level of accessibility back to zero. And this presents many risks, and we would categorize this as a problem with procurement.
So yeah, procurement is definitely a big challenge. The issue, of course, not purely lie at the supplier door. Your organization needs to be able to identify accessibility issues and be confident to actually raise them without authority. So, there's a lot of kind of challenges to think about when it comes to accessibility. How do internal teams challenge a supplier if they're less equipped to assess the accessibility of a system? Again, they should be thinking in terms of capability. And this kind of brings us on to this point that compliance with the guidelines doesn't guarantee accessible experience.
No, it doesn't. Absolutely. We see this all the time. Often organizations, they're falling into the trap of thinking that compliance with the guidelines, that somehow means that they are offering accessible experiences. And we certainly see that is far too simplistic. It's definitely possible to design an experience that follows the guidelines, but is actually still inaccessible. And, thinking about that for a moment, why is that? Well, we saw in some of the earlier talks, this week that guidelines might not cover your technology or channel. There can be gaps in the guidelines. So, for example, there are best practices, which we know lead to better experiences, but they're not required. And some examples, again, echoing Alan Amani's great talk from yesterday, are that there's no requirement, to reach AA conformance for, say, descriptive link text in certain contexts, nor the avoidance of publishing content in PDFs, and the same we can say for the use of complex tables, for example. And just expanding on that a little bit more, we've got a timeline on screen which shows the process of creating the guidelines, and it is a detailed process over a long time. There's expert input, there's surveys and usability research, and that process is so that the guidelines they're useful, that they're testable and effective. And it requires careful consideration. The guidelines also need to be abstracted in such a way that they can be used by different audiences in different contexts. As mentioned, while the guidelines can't cover all aspects of inclusion, they are useful in reducing build and test time for teams, and they support reaching this baseline standard of accessibility. And Alistair Campbell, our accessibility director, he plays a key role in continuing to extend and improve them from WCAG 2.1 to 2.2, and then looking a bit ahead beyond to Silver.
Yeah, and when I think about the kind of idea for, say, Silver as the guidelines, that was kind of partly what sort of inspired the sort of 2050 story. But there's the bigger issue is ambition for an accessible experience means little if there's a gap between the sort of goals that the organization is setting out and their capability to actually deliver on those goals. And that kind of brings us on to this idea that, compliance in itself is not a strategy. As we discussed, accessible design represents competitive advantage.
But how can organizations tell that that's the case then, Simon?
Well, to achieve inclusive design, you need to think and act strategically. You need an accessibility strategy. So they'll have an accessibility strategy if they're thinking about accessibility as something that they can gain competitive advantage with.
Yeah, on that point, I think a lack of urgency around having a strategy might be explained by organizations not realizing, that if they're not designing, planning, testing and measuring, then I don't think they're always aware that they're unknowingly introducing barriers, whether it's an act of omission or commission. They might not realize that they're causing harm and they're losing out commercially as well.
Absolutely right. Designing, planning and testing are key implementation aspects of a strategy. Ultimately, the accessibility strategy drives the outcome of inclusion. So it's positively focused on commission, a point you previously made, Joel. This requires an inclusive design approach, not just an accessibility approach. What
we're talking about there, what we're saying is inclusion is ultimately a broader view, isn't it? So, as we've kind of touched upon, compliance is often sort of specifically associated with digital, rather than holistically. But again, having said that, aiming for compliance can be a good place for organizations to start. It allows them to establish this kind of initial baseline.
Yeah, absolutely agree. So, whereas accessibility is often represented digitally, inclusion covers all devices and technologies, all channels and all situations. This is the importance of sort of inclusive thinking. We're moving away from a one-to-many and to this kind of customizable perspective where we get one-to-one. And this kind of brings us on to capability as the foundation of inclusion. The first consideration when you're planning a strategic approach to accessibility is based on determining how capable your organization is at developing accessible products and services, and how you would go about measuring that.
So obviously you mentioned there about this kind of key idea of capability being a huge factor for organizations. And when we look at this process diagram on screen, what we need to be thinking about is what it's showing is how it clearly indicates this integration between the strategy perspective, and that's kind of this policy thinking, and then the process. And this is really where we're looking at the framework for delivery of accessibility and inclusion.
Absolutely right. And when we see, between the kind of strategy and implementation is a relationship between business management, which are the kind of leadership elements, and design management, which are the kind of delivery elements. And they work together to kind of demonstrate a level of capability.
Adding to that, capability represents this mix of design management and business management, and both provide the kind of foundation of the accessibility skills, activities, and technologies you use to design accessible user interfaces and experiences.
Yeah, so it's also supported by policy, which is reflected in leadership and has an accessibility measures built in, which we kind of call performance. And the whole organization works collaboratively, which we can kind of think and measure in terms of integration. So kind of what we're going to come on to now is we're going to kind of introduce our capability model here. Yeah. So this kind of model allows us to assess capability of an organization or team in terms of accessibility. We can then use the data to create a program of accessibility improvement and education. It's composed of 3 parts: a profiler, a list of questions, a capability graph, a visualization of capability, and an accessibility quadrant, one of the 4 levels of capability or accessibility maturity.
So building on that then, if we start with the profiler aspect, if we focus on that, what we have here is we can analyze an organization's experience capability through a specific set of questions. And those cover these 6 scales of experience. And those scales are activities, skills, infrastructure, integration, performance, and leadership. And then those scales are then grouped into 2 different dimensions. So again, we mentioned these before. We've got design management, and this is how well you execute experience. And then we have business management, and this focuses on the planning of experience. And with all those things together, then we've got, the answers from this set of questions. They then feed into this visualization of the results, and that's in the form of a graph.
Right. So let's look at an example. So, here in the results, they show us a bias towards design management. In this example, which is an energy organization, the team displays a higher set of scores, relating to the skills and activity, and lower scores in business management. This is very commonly seen in organizations where accessibility and experience are treated as silo activities, a point we previously made. And we would categorize this organization as a misfiring expert, which means that they're going to have people that are really accomplished at accessibility, doing the right things, the right activities with the right level of skills, that really are passionate about accessibility, and they're probably using the right tools. But because there's no integration with business management, their work has little value in terms of it's not measured. There's no performance or value. There's no leadership, no policy, no overarching integration with how they could turn this into a competitive advantage.
So you mentioned there, for example, just one of the categories, within this kind of capability model, and you mentioned, the misfiring expert. Just drawing on that a bit more, if we look at some of the other elements within this quadrant, we can see that there are some other categories of capability, and where might organizations sit? With the first example we've got here is the idea of this accessibility entrant. And what we're saying is that's the kind of organization that's just beginning to become aware of the importance of experience. We have the frustrated visionary, and that is represented by high scores in business management, but low on the design management side. The misfiring experts, which we heard about, is the high scores in design management, but low in the business management. And so as we say, this is that classic silo mentality. And then finally, we've got this idea of the aligned champions, which we're kind of saying that's the ideal balance.
Yeah, it's difficult to become an aligned champion. And those that are aligned champions will absolutely have a strategy for how they become expert at delivering inclusive experience. So, to succeed, you should look at what is produced. For example, the quality of your code, the organization that you produces. You might get this information in the form of an accessibility audit, for example, but you also need to look at how work is actually done, how that code is actually produced, the planning and the processes behind that. These two dimensions of analysis provide a measure of your capability.
So with all that in mind then, summing all those various ideas up, what we're really saying is if you want to deliver an accessible experience and you want to do that across devices and channels and situations, then you need to be taking this kind of inclusive design approach that we've spoken about throughout this conversation.
Yeah, and if your goal is more focused on initially becoming compliant, then you need to take a different approach. However, you can do both. You can go from a compliant to an inclusive perspective. And our view is a 21st century view. We believe in the power of humanizing technology and how it can deliver exceptional experience and competitive advantage. This is why we are so passionate about basically trying to get everyone to think and design in this way.
Absolutely. This is absolutely key. And I suppose that brings me on to, if you've been watching this and you're interested in some of these key topics that we've spoken about together, and if you're keen to take a sort of strategic plunge that we're recommending, then we recommend you consider taking our free and anonymous accessibility assessment. So the details here on screen, the outputs from this assessment provide you with a quick measure of your accessibility capability of today. So go to nemento.com/AA, for example.
Yeah, so I think that kind of brings us on to the, the question and answers section. So thank you very much, Joel. That was an enjoyable conversation, and I hope it was for you guys as well.
Oh, thank you very much, Simon. Cheers.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. What a fantastic presentation. For everyone watching, please do submit your questions for Simon and Joel using the Q&A function. I can't see any in there yet, so please do submit your questions. But yeah, so guys, I mean, you spoke about accessibility capability, and I know a lot of companies are at the beginning of, or kind of haven't even started their accessibility journey yet. Oftentimes, senior leadership aren't interested and don't see it as a priority. What would be your advice to those companies and kind of designers within those companies that kind of want to be better from an accessibility perspective, but don't really know where to start, or kind of need that buy-in from the top table?
Shall I start with that?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So, whereas traditionally people have taken a kind of, let's look at the quality of our outputs, let's look at the quality of our websites, our apps, our platforms, our services, our products, etc., which can kind of be addressed through things like examination of code. The other side of the coin is how that code is produced. So, as we kind of said in the presentation, Henry, if you're thinking about capability, you need to be thinking about how the organization is set up to kind of plan and deliver on the kind of accessibility sort of objectives. And that means that you need to kind of be thinking in terms of assessing the kind of capability of the organization, as well as assessing the outputs that the organization produces.
Yeah, definitely. So I think one of the key things there is that, and this is something that, I've been thinking about a lot, is that organizations are still tending to talk about accessibility like it's a sort of technical problem to be solved. And they're focusing as sort of too much on the risk and the legal side of things, which I think is why, again, it's not necessarily something that many organizations are jumping on, because, as I say, they're seeing it as a problem to be solved rather than this huge potential sort of competitive advantage. And I think that's playing into the reason why we're still not seeing as many organizations kind of investing in the capability in their organization.
Yeah, and I mean, thinking about Alan and Marnie's presentation yesterday, they sort of kind of neatly concluded their excellent presentation with some stats. And one of the stats was that a lot of organizations are actually talking about inclusivity, but only 4% are actually doing something about it. And the fact is that when you start to speak to these organizations, it's really difficult because you say, right, we want to be customer centric, we want to be inclusive, we want to be accessible. Well, if those things are true objectives, then there will be strategy around them, and they will be working to execute on that strategy. If there isn't strategy, it's a bit of a sign that there is no business management function that's supporting it. So again, it kind of goes back to the idea that, they're kind of treating this kind of key activity in a silo mentality way. And that's not really how you embed accessibility at all. You have to think of it as something that doesn't just start at the beginning, but it's kind of fundamental to the way that you design. And as we showed in that sort of experience diagram, it's sort of at the very heart of excellence in digital experience. So, if you're kind of really keen on doing that, you do need to be thinking quite strategically about how you set out a plan for that, how you then measure the value of that plan, and deliver against that plan.
Brilliant. Thanks, Si. So we've got another question here from Alex, who asks, who do you think is doing inclusive design really well at the moment? So, for example, we know a lot of the public sector are. Do you have any other examples that kind of are shining a light from an accessibility point of view?
Yeah, as you say, your mind is always drawn to a lot of public sector stuff, and for good reason. So yeah, talking about sort of public sector organisations, obviously we tend to look at the government digital service, and as I say, that's for good reason. Their online design system and the kind of collaboration, again, that we spoke about before, and the level of capability is certainly a sort of leading light. I think, Co-op are doing some really great stuff, and again, NHS have done some really great stuff. And I think we heard mention of this in previous talks. The NHS work around content design and this kind of, again, the relationship between content design, plain language, and sort of the cognitive aspects of accessibility. It's a really interesting space. But I would go back to Microsoft. If you have a look at their inclusive design section, they have a whole inclusive design toolkit, loads of case studies, and that's a really great example of where designing with people with disabilities right throughout the kind of project life cycle is yielding these brilliant results. They've even come up with a whole set of accessibility guidelines kind of a flavor of the guidelines we've been talking about, but specifically for the Xbox platform as well. So that would definitely be, I'd say, kind of look at the Xbox stuff online for a kind of commercial, from the commercial perspective.
Yeah, and I think, building on top of that as well, I mean, Gareth had a really great presentation this morning, and, here's a person that's helped an organization really embed accessibility quite deeply. So it's kind of one of those things that, are there truly great examples that we can look at? I think that they're starting to emerge, and to your point, Joel, I think Microsoft are really kind of acting as a leader in this and kind of showing us how to think about it. And on top of that as well, it kind of brings me on to that kind of book by Holmes, who's ex-Microsoft, called Mismatch, which has got really great examples in there as well. But we'll know that we've succeeded when we've got that 21st century view that we're no longer just talking about technology. We are actually talking about how we design everything for us that provides a sense of equal participation, because what we don't want to do is reduce human capability, human brain power. Who knows how many geniuses are out there that are restricted from expressing themselves or actually literally solving problems that we might not be able to basically think can be solved because they're, they can't use the right technology. So I think we have to see this as a much bigger challenge and a much greater opportunity. If we want to act with care and consideration at the highest level of ethic, then we need to ensure that we can design so that there is equal and fair participation for all.
Brilliant. Thanks, Si. So we have a question from Irfan here. With respect to getting senior buy-in, it'd be good to see some more seminars on how to talk to the C-suite about accessibility in a way that resonates with them. Asking if we have any plans in this area. Yes, we have. We have 2 more conferences coming up this year, both virtual. We have Collaborate Virtual, which will be announced very soon, and that's coming up on the 12th to the 16th of July, and Interact again in October. So yes, no, this is definitely a topic that we're going to be covering there. Brilliant. So I think that's just about all we've got time for. Simon and Joel, thank you so much for a brilliant presentation. We will be back in just over an hour for the final presentation of Virtually, where we'll have a panel on the future of accessibility, where we will be joined by experts in emerging tech, Pete Traynor, Georgia Rackson, and Laura Shearman, and that is going to be moderated by Simon. So yes, please do join us then for our final session. And yeah, thank you to Simon and Joel, and thanks for everyone tuning in. I mean, I know we've had people from Johannesburg to Lima join us today, so it's always great to see people all over the world joining us. So yeah, thank you, and yeah, we'll see you in just over an hour.
Cheers.